I am honored to be with y'all for this day, for this special event, and I think what Dr. Smith was saying is real, especially as an Asian American. One thing I've realized is we haven't been really often involved in these discussions about reconciliation, and some of that's not being asked and not being invited, but honestly, on the other end, it's also not wanting to put ourselves there. So I'm excited for this chance here. Before I go into some, I'm really glad for the two brothers who shared before, because they laid such a good social, cultural, theological grounding, which I'm not going to do. That's why I'm really glad for what they did. But just a little bit about my story, which explains kind of why I'm passionate about reconciliation. For a lot of my life, I lived a very angry kind of life. I was mean-hearted. I had a lot of anger. A lot of it was tied to racial and ethnic issues. So I hated people and expressed myself in violence. I hated white people. I hated black people. Don't stop. This is not the end of the story. I was equal opportunity. I even hated some other Asian peoples. A lot of anger, a lot of violence, to the point where ultimately one altercation got arrested, and that was a whole nother story. But in the midst of that, I experienced the grace and the mercy of Jesus Christ that reached down to me. And as far as I was from him, I was astounded to learn of this God that wanted me, this God that wanted to draw me to himself and to be reconciled vertically, as Dr. Williams was talking about, to be reconciled vertically. How then could I withhold reconciliation from my fellow human brother and sister? So that's been a little bit of the reason why I'm passionate about these things. And then we started the Village Church a few years ago in Baltimore. And I want to be really clear. We never put out there as our main vision or our main value diversity, because I think if your main value is diversity, that can lead you into some wonky places. But the gospel is our main thing. But we also believe that if you get the gospel right, you got to work really hard to not cross barriers that society, culture, history have always put. So at our church, and it's taken some years, but we definitely have an ethnic representation. At this point, we're probably about, and I don't got precise numbers, probably like 45% Anglo, maybe like 35% Asian American, 15% African American, and then however the math works out, other peoples there together. But when I talk about our diversity, we use the word multicultural, because often my experience has been you can be multi-ethnic, but still be all kind of the same people. Like, you're exactly the same. You just look different in your skin, whereas multicultural, I think, sometimes is even a greater area of diversity. So we talk about class, especially in Baltimore, where we've got folks who are like studying PhDs and educated and fairly suburban, upper middle class background, with folks right from our neighborhood who are not, with like PhDs with sixth grade educations together, becoming family. Brother from another mother with the same father. You know, what does that look like in the power of the gospel? So that explains it for us. And as I was thinking about the idea of class particularly, we're trying to raise up people, especially in preaching. And I remember last year we had one of our pastoral interns. He's from our neighborhood, born and bred, raised. He ex-drug dealer in our neighborhood, prison record, a lot of stereotypical things you might think of this city. But Jesus Christ has done an amazing work in his life, and now he's one of our pastoral interns. And he was up there preaching. And I was thinking about it. It was amazing because, and I can't think of too many other settings where someone with that background will be sitting in front of a group of a lot of people who don't have that, and they're listening, and they're being guided by him. And it reminded me that the issue of power is just present in preaching. There's a lot, and we can over-spiritualize and say, no, it's all about humble servanthood, and, just, I'm here. Yeah, that's good. Hopefully, but there's also power. There's power. And preaching, as it's a powerful thing, I wanted to talk about that a little bit because I think it really translates to these issues of reconciliation. And I'm going to look right into the word here. If you can start to turn there, looking at Luke 9. But I think we see some great examples of biblical power here, particularly as we look at the life of Jesus. And we're not going to read this part, but if you looked earlier in chapter 9, you just see this amazing story. I hope if you're here at Southern Seminary, these things are like familiar to you, but just in case, these amazing stories, Jesus feeding 5,000, and we all know probably that means closer to 15,000 because you're including women and children there. So I would have loved to be there to see what that looks like. Like giving out, it just keeps coming, it would have been amazing. I would have loved to see that. So Jesus has just done this amazing miracle. And his disciples, they've witnessed it. And if you study this, you know that this was really for his disciples to be able to see and to observe. So they've seen it. They've seen the power that Jesus has. And I can imagine, it doesn't say here, but I can imagine they're like, yes, we finally got picked for the right team. We finally got picked for the cool kids. So after that, that's where we go into verse 18. We find this encounter. Verse 18, where it says, now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him. And he asked them, who did the crowd say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist. But others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen. Then he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered, the Christ of God. So Jesus, he's continuing to train his disciples, and he asks a seemingly simple enough question. So what are folks saying? Like, who do they saying I am? And he gets some different answers. But then Jesus asks the big question, how about all y'all? Who do you say that I am? And Peter, sometimes he's a knucklehead, but he gives this tremendous answer. He really gets it. You are the Christ. Peter gets it that Jesus is the anointed one. He is the Messiah. He's the king who's been promised from God through all the ages, who's finally going to come and make everything that's been wrong right. He's going to be coming as the rescuer, full of power, just full of power. So Jesus, he accepts this title, the Messiah, but then he just blows it up. He's like, yeah, I'm the king, but here's how it's going to look. And you look at verse 21, and he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And I imagine that when Jesus said that he must suffer, that was shocking, because no one was picturing the coming king to be associated with suffering and death. When they thought Messiah, they're picturing a mighty warrior who would be sent to defeat evil and injustice. Probably, maybe I'm too much of the flesh. I'm picturing someone that looked like The Rock, like Dwayne Johnson. That's how I would picture the Messiah coming, like boom, right? Where the evil at? Coming to get it. But suffering, dying, it really made no sense, especially since they've seen with their own eyes the power that this man holds. Because it's one thing if you got a really weak little, yeah. And then he says, we got to suffer and die. Oh, okay, we'll go suffer and die. But when you've seen what he can do, when you've seen the bread and the fish, and when you've seen the healings, and you see that he's got power, and then he's saying, but I'm going to suffer and die, it makes no sense. It's really nonsensical. Yet the ministry of Christ, and we know this, and that's part of the reason we love him, right? He exhibited humility throughout his ministry, even to the point of willing servanthood and even submission to others. Some of this submission, it was to evil people, evil authorities who would kill him. But his humility, it also took the form of serving his very own followers, as we read of in John 13 during the Lord's Supper. That the middle of this intimate meal that he shared with his closest followers before his death, we see what he does with them. In John chapter 13, in verse 2, during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And we see this amazing, just humbling picture of servanthood. That the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, who has every right for everyone to bow down before him, is getting on his knees, taking off his watch, and washing the nasty, grimy feet of his followers, when they should be doing the exact thing for him. And Andy Crouch, if you've heard of him, just brilliant man. He writes a book called Playing God. I would encourage you to pick that up if you're interested in issues of power, and I think especially with reconciliation, there's a lot of effects there. But Andy Crouch, he talks about power, and he particularly looks at the life of Christ, as we see here. And his observation is that often when folks talk about Christ's earthly ministry, and they see how he submitted himself, how he served, they often talk about it in language like Jesus gave up his power. He gave up his power. But Crouch, what he suggests is that this idea that Christ gave up his power to his earliest followers, to his earliest biographers, they wouldn't get that at all. Those who would walk with him, they're like, he didn't give up no power. I mean, he expressed it differently, but he was still full of power. But when he was submitting to his captors, when he was washing the feet of his disciples, these were actually demonstrations of the very power that Christ had. That Jesus never lost sight of who he was. He was always crystal clear who he was in nature. So as he explains to his disciples after washing their feet, in verse 13 of that same chapter, he says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." He's very clear of who he is. Jesus is not into this kind of false humility, but he acknowledges his identity to his followers. He acknowledges, yeah, I am powerful. He uses these words that would connote that kind of power in the disciples' word. The title of teacher, rabbi, just a very respectful, high authority, kind of high power kind of position, as well as Lord. This idea of kurios, the very lordship that you would give to someone like Caesar. Jesus saying, yeah, that's me. You're right, that's me. All to say, what appears throughout the life of Christ as giving up power is actually the very culmination and demonstration of his power. What looked like to eyes of flesh, like, oh yeah, he given up, it's actually demonstrating, in essence, who he is. And Crouch describes it that Jesus is not giving up power, rather he's giving up his privilege and his status. He's not giving up power, but what he's given up before these other people is his privilege, his rights, his status. And we know the famous words of Philippians 2, right? This beautiful passage that we read in verse 6, that though he, Jesus, though he was in the form of God, when it says though, it's not saying that Christ displayed humility despite being God, rather because he was God. It's just the nature of who he is. That for Jesus, there was a confidence in his life, and he lived it in humility and servanthood to others because he precisely knew who he was. He did not have to defend his power. He did not have to even demonstrate it necessarily. He knew who he was. Thus, he could confidently serve and humble himself, eventually even to the point of death on a cross. And his followers, right, they wouldn't fully get this until Jesus' death. They wouldn't get it till they're on the other side of his death and his resurrection. But what Jesus was introducing was this radical idea of the kingdom, that he was flipping the whole script. I mean, up became down, forward became back, sacrifice became gain. And as we see with Jesus, it's that through sacrificial death, others might find life as well. It's not a pointless sacrifice, but through sacrifice, life would eventually flow. And that as Jesus brought in this revolutionary message of good news, that ultimately even death was the means of life and power. The thing that looked like the least power was actually the greatest power in Jesus' death. And we read in Luke 9, 23, 24, those famous verses, right? That's the same call Jesus gives to his followers. And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. And we got to get this clear, guys. Ultimately, what Jesus is saying here, this is ultimately not some call to a really life of pious sacrifice. Say, come on, guys, that's what good people do, right? We really sacrifice and we give up ourselves. It's rather, he's giving them the means to live in true power. If you really want to live in power, this is what it's going to take. If you really want to exhibit the power of God, it's going to mean giving up so you can get. So in our church, as we preach reconciliation, you can probably tell, we talk about death a lot. I'm always talking about death. I'm always talking about giving up, servanthood, sacrifice, because I've read all the books, right? I've read all the church growth books. That's the way you draw a lot of people. I just talk about death and suffering, and that's how you draw people, right? You just talk about how you're going to have to die to yourself, and life is going to stink, so come on, join our church. And the reason why is a lot of folks I've observed, everyone nowadays, it's the cool thing, right? Everyone loves diversity, unless you're like a KKK church. But everyone, most other people love the idea of diversity and reconciliation. But I think sometimes we don't fully recognize that for that to happen, it requires a whole community of folks dying to themselves. Yeah. For it to really happen well. I love what the doctor was saying, that you can look like you're doing it, but not really. But to really live it out and do it, it's going to require a whole bunch of people saying, okay, this is not about me anymore. It's about me dying to myself. I want to be really careful before anything else, because I don't want to water down martyrdom by using the word death cheaply, because, we all know, right, that around the world, literally, people are dying in their flesh because of what they believe. So I want to be careful. I'm not using the word death cheaply. But in our church, we take seriously passages like Philippians 2:3, where it says, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. We don't think that the Apostle Paul was just giving us a nice kind of idea. I think we take the Bible literally. I think he was saying, actually, you know what? If you follow Jesus, if you believe who he is, it means that other people, their rights, their happiness, their welfare is just as important as yours, if not more. It's this idea, again, just as Christ did, of what does it look like to give up privilege and status for the sake of another? Because you know who you are. Because your identity in Christ is firm and solid. You don't have to fight for that. Now you can give up for the sake of someone else. So dying to self, when we talk about reconciliation, I think it might mean that we choose to be part of a community where things may not always feel like a great fit for me. Can we say that? Like, to go to a church where you want to be part of a diverse church of reconciliation, it might mean, everything's not going to be exactly the way that you like. It's not going to be all about your tastes and preferences. It's not going to be checking off of the box. Oh, this is the most perfect church in the world. Yeah. It means submission to another, even in a world where the whole world tells you it's all about your rights and your happiness. We talk about countercultural. We get it wonky in the church world. We talk about countercultural. It's like not about watching certain movies or certain music and all that weird stuff. Countercultural is in a world that says, it's all about you. Live for hedonism. Make yourself happy, to say, no, die to yourself. Live for others. That's countercultural. And I think that carries a lot of implications for a church community. And obviously, for the sake of what we're doing here today, I think this dynamic is often seen in the preaching of the word in a church. What does it look like to die to yourself when it talks about preaching? And for me personally, and maybe it's just my limitations as a preacher, one of my greatest challenges in our church is, how do I preach one sermon that's supposed to impact a diverse group of people? It would be different if I said, okay, I got one sermon this week. Okay, we're going through the book of Acts. Oh, okay, I'm going to get all you Hopkins students, and we're going to gather for like half an hour. I'm going to give you your version of it, and we're going to hit all the application points that speak to you. Okay, all you folks native to our neighborhood, I know it's all different, so we're going to go here. You homeschool moms, okay, we're going to stay with you. We will give you your version. Okay, all you Asians, I know you're all different cultures, so we're going to speak your version. I wouldn't do that even if I had the hours, because we're one church. So I get one shot. I get one sermon, and we're saying, God, take this word, like Pentecost, right? Lord, take this one word and help translate it to a whole bunch of different people here. And I believe that. I believe in the supernatural power of God. I believe God can do that, but I'm also a realist. And what I've come to experience, that in a diverse setting, that's nearly impossible for every person to feel every sermon hits them exactly like straight into heart. Because even as we trust in the supernatural power of God to do that with one sermon, I've had to recognize that as much as I try, as well as I maybe feel like I prepare, certain messages will impact some people more than others in a diverse setting. I attribute it, maybe I'm kind of a violent person, I attribute it to boxing. Like if you're in a fight, if you're in a boxing match, right, your fight, there are some punches where you go just a roundhouse, right? You just knock someone out, right? It's just coming hard, coming around, and it just hits squarely and the person's out. But there's some punches that it's going to be more of a jab maybe, or maybe you're going to kind of glance off the shoulder, and it's not like it's knocking them out, but they feel the impact. And I think in a way, in a diverse setting, that's almost like what preaching is. That there are going to be some messages, you throw it out there. Maybe you're talking about issues of justice. And for some people, that's going to be like the knockout punch. They're like, oh my goodness, God cares about this stuff? And I haven't been living for justice? Let me repent. And other people can be like, oh, well, that was thought-provoking, but I don't know if I'm fully there. Whereas other people, you talk about issues of shame. Maybe for Asian Americans in our context, we talk about issues of shame, and they're right there, like weeping as they're listening. And other folks might maybe don't totally get it. Maybe you talk about issues of poverty. And for some of our folks, preaching this idea that even though you're poor, you have the riches of Christ, that's a different message that's going to be heard from someone who's wondering how they're going to eat dinner tonight compared to someone who's got a lot in the bank. So that's just the reality, though, of how we view preaching. That some punches or some messages are going to be like knockouts, while others maybe are like a glancing blow on the shoulder. Hopefully nothing totally misses. You know, your goal is you hit something. But I think that's almost got to be an approach to how you preach in a diverse context. So when I'm talking about dying to myself in preaching, what that means for me, and again, maybe this is just my own issues, part of me dying to myself is I have to be willing to hear things like, man, the preaching is really not as deep as I would like it to be. And that's hard because I don't know if you can tell, I'm actually not white. I'm Asian American. In my cultural background, there's a real high emphasis and importance placed on the intellect. And like as a preacher, probably the best compliment you can get is, wow, I didn't even understand that. Wow, that was deep. Man, that was so deep that I don't even know what to do with it. That's like a compliment. That's a compliment where you're going into all the scholarly things and really hitting it deep. But I tell people, well, that's not what we're doing at our church. That's not my goal. It's not like I can't do that if I want. I mean, I'm not saying I would do it well. I mean, I could do that. I could pull out the seminary level, like give you a seminary course in discernment. I'm not saying I would do it well, but I could try. But that's not what our church is going to be about. Because we're trying to throw out a message that's general enough for all people, and hopefully, depending on the week, it'll hit different people in different ways. But you got to know it's probably not going to hit you every week the same way. But as a preacher, I got to be honest, that's something I've had to learn to die to myself, because there's certain pride you feel when people, you know if you preach, right? When people tell you, oh, that was deep, you're like, yeah, wasn't it? Yeah, I put in like 30 hours that way. Yeah, it better be deep. You know, you get a certain pride, but what's the opposite of when people say, oh, man, that was a simple message? No preacher wants to hear their message was simple, right? But if it's understandable, if it leads people to repentance, if it's impacting other people, man, isn't that the goal of preaching? Sometimes we got to learn to die to some of these things that we elevate as more important. A good rule for me has been that my audience is not my ex-seminary professor. Some of us, especially young preachers, we preach like our homiletics professor sitting there watching us and grading you and like, did you get all the 18 points in that sermon? Did you get all the Greek and the Hebrew and you know, did you get? And you know what? I mean, unless your mission is to reach seminary professors, I mean, that might be a valid thing. If that's your mission, hit that hard. Hit that hard, you know? But for most of us, I would suggest that's probably not our mission field, and you got to know who you're trying to preach to. And there's dying. I think it's a healthy development, but it is a dying process for a preacher to learn to communicate across cultures, because it might mean dying to how others consider you. Whether people think you're a smart person, or whether you have your stuff together, or you're one of these, you know, whatever it might be. And I think this isn't just for the preacher. As much as this is good work in developing the preacher for reconciliation, I think it also helps to disciple your people. At our church, and I'm totally ripping this off of someone I heard at a conference, I cannot remember now because I'm getting old where to attribute it, but the 75% rule, we talk about that at our church, that in a diverse church, there should be a certain point. If you've got a diversity of people, there should be like a point where you're not like extremely fully happy with like more than 75% of what happens in that church. I'm not talking like core doctrines. Like, I'm not saying choose 2/3 of the Trinity or something like that. I'm not saying that, but more issues of preference, issues of style, issues of kind of like, you know, flow, and you know, yeah, I really dig it. If you're going to be part of a church with people who are not exactly like you, there should be a certain point where like around 25, if it's like less than that, that's going to be hard. I mean, you don't want to be a church where you hate everything, right? But there's got to be a certain point where like, you know what, I agree with like a majority, like around 3/4, but there's some stuff, it's not like I hate it, but it's not like I'm here for that reason. You know, it's like not like that speaks to my heart, Because what it means is usually if you're like at a church where like 98% you're like, oh yeah, every preference of mine is here, probably everyone at a church is very similar to who you are. And so where that comes into preaching then, it's kind of what I was talking about earlier. There's got to be that sense that at our church at least, and we just tell this up front to people, if you're going to be part of our church, you need to know you are probably not going to hear a sermon every week that you feel like is a home run for you. I'm going to pick on a little bit. I can do this because I'm Reformed myself. So if you're Reformed, I'm not picking on you because I'm not Reformed. I'm Reformed too. But because of where we are as a church, we're starting to get more kind of like young, restless, and Reformed folks if they're moving to Baltimore, they hear about us before they even come, and they want to come because they hear we're diverse and stuff, and they love it, and then they come. And I can tell there's a tension, right? I can tell there's a tension because they love the diversity part, but they're listening to some of the sermons, and I'm not going to fill in names here. I got to really try, but it's not like a certain way. It's not like a certain preach. It's not like a certain thing. It's not deep, whatever that word means anymore. I have no idea what that means anymore. But it's not a certain way. And what I tell them usually, like when we're doing introduction to membership or stuff, I tell them up front, yo, you need to know we want you at this church. We would love for you to commit to this church. But if you're going to be part of this church, you need to know that the preaching might not always feel like that young, restless, Reformed kind of teaching, whatever that means. Whatever that means, and you got to be okay with that because you got to realize the church is more than just a sermon. Right. Because maybe every week doesn't fully hit you like a home run, but look at the person across from you in the aisle. Look at them, that they're face to the ground, and the Holy Spirit is repairing them and speaking to them. Yeah, maybe it didn't do it to you, but it's not all about you. And that's discipleship, guys. Because in a world where everyone, since you're a baby, your mama's taught you the most beautiful, you're the most precious. In a world like that, it's good for people to hear, well, you know what? We love you, but it's not all about you. You're part of something bigger than yourself. So learn to receive some stuff that doesn't feel like it's totally about you. And that's good for you. That's okay. And I think one way to help cultivate this kind of dying to self for our people is for people to sit under preaching that might not be their normal preference. For some of your people, if you're in a diverse church, that preacher might be you. I mean, you might be that preacher that's different for a lot of people. And our church is funny because I joke that I think at the Village, I think our African Americans, our church, actually like my preaching more than anyone because I just like get really, I'm kind of trying to tone it down here because I know I'm a Southern Seminary, but I get really excited when I preach. I think our African American folks really love it. Our Asian folks are good because and then the funny joke about our Anglo brothers and sisters, sometimes they're like, in the beginning, they're like, man, why is he so mad? Is he mad about something? Why is he yelling so much? Did we do something wrong? And just learning that's just the way we do it. But to learn to sit under that and that it's okay. It's okay to learn some of these different things. I want to encourage some of you, especially maybe if you lead a church here and you're the primary preacher, maybe dying to self looks like sharing your pulpit with those who may not preach through the same cultural lens you have. Hear me again, right? I'm not saying compromise your core values just for the sake of diversity. So, hey, you're black. I don't know if you believe in Jesus. Can you preach at our church because you're black? No, that's horrible. That's wrong. I'm not saying that. But welcome into your pulpit those with whom you share the most important things, like what's really essential, and under whom you might learn things about God that you would not otherwise. Because that's one of the beautiful things about diversity. When we talk about preaching, with people of different cultural lens, you will probably learn things about God that you haven't even thought about, that have not even been a reality to you. Again, if you lead your church, one suggestion I'd have, and this is something we did in our church earlier on, if you have the opportunity to bring in guest speakers who are not of your majority culture. And this is especially beneficial if your desire is to cultivate diversity in church, even if you're not currently there. Honestly, for our church, when we first started, for first few years, we were actually all Anglo except for my family. And my wife would joke and make fun of me, man, you can't even reach your own people. What's going on here, right? This is just all white folk in our family for a while. But I would intentionally bring in African American friends who I know could preach a solid word, not for tokenism, but our neighborhood in Baltimore is one of the whitest neighborhoods in Baltimore. It's also one of the most racially charged neighborhoods in Baltimore. Like 25 years ago, if you were African American, you don't walk through our neighborhood because you get thrown off a bridge, that kind of tension. So walking in our neighborhood, even now, when I talk to some folks, they'll use certain words that like make you blush. They're like, oh, okay, let's keep that quiet because, that's not how we talk about certain people anymore. This is 2015. But in front of our folks in our church, I want to put before them people that they might have never thought of as role models. Intelligent, well-spoken, spiritually powerful men of character who model for them something that they've never thought of, that starts to crush all their stereotypes. And that was before we had much diversity in our church, but there's something about that. People get used to hearing different voices, and it starts to grow the church in different ways. I just think, and it doesn't happen overnight. It definitely doesn't happen overnight. I'm going to put this out. I didn't know if I was going to mention this, but I'm going to put this out there. If you are here and if you don't lead a church right now, maybe you're not the lead pastor or lead preacher in your church, I'm going to challenge you. Maybe you need to go to a church or learn to sit under teaching of someone who's of a different culture than you. Because my experience has been, man, everyone, again, wants a diverse church. Everyone would love that. But they want their church to be diverse. Far fewer people are willing to sit under the leadership and main teaching of someone of a different culture than them. And I would suggest to you, if you have the freedom in your life right now to do that, maybe one of the best steps, if you're serious about all this, I'm thinking if you're sitting on a Monday afternoon in a seminary classroom, unless you got to do it for class, you're probably serious about this, maybe that's a step for you to take and submit under someone who's culturally different than you. And learn to follow them. Learn to submit to their authority. And I think, in doing these things, having different people in our pulpit, I think we disciple our majority cultures, but you might also minister to the minority cultures in your church when you do that. I was just, yesterday actually, I was sharing a little bit at one of our churches here in the city of Louisville, and I had the opportunity to go up on the stage and just speak at their services. I wasn't even giving a sermon. I was just talking, I had to stop because I was about to go into sermon, but just 2-3 minutes and just sharing about what's going on. And after church, I was leaving, and I saw these girls start running towards me in the parking lot. And it was actually three Asian girls, and they came up to me, and the oldest one, I don't know if she was a teenager or a young adult, they're 3 Chinese girls who were adopted into this family. And they came up to me, and the oldest girl started saying, hey, we wanted to come talk to you because we've never seen someone that looks like us preaching. And I almost started crying there in the parking lot. Because for them, they've always thought of the power position, the preacher, as someone who's not them. So without recognizing, and I think Doctor really went into it well, these are deep systemic things, and those messages start to build up after a while, and you start to think of yourself as less than because you never see someone who looks like you in an authoritative position, who's teaching, who's guiding, who's leading. But for those girls, when they saw that, just a little, you could tell there's a little glimmer of hope. Wow, this is open. This isn't just like a white thing or just a certain, but this is for all of us here. So especially for the minorities in your congregations, to have different people of different backgrounds, it can be extremely encouraging and uplifting to the whole body. When we talk about reconciliation and preaching, I think we have to talk about the idea that it might mean a prophetic call to talk about things that may otherwise be ignored. As a preacher, we talk about power. You get to set the tone for what is appropriate to talk about in your church. What you talk about in the pulpit becomes safe conversations for other people in your church. So if you don't talk about issues of justice, other people won't think you can talk about issues of justice. If you don't talk about issues of reconciliation and race and ethnicity, people aren't going to wonder if they can talk about these things. If you don't talk about gender inequality, people are not going to know if they can talk about these things. But when you bring it out, because you do set the tone. Again, hopefully the preacher's a servant and humble and all that, but there's power. You do set the tone, and people will follow your lead. So, an example, again, we had a little bit going on in Baltimore this past spring. You might have heard about it. Just a little bit, right? A little bit of tension. But, we had these riots. And the crazy thing was, in the middle of the riots, there were many churches, very clearly it said, we're not going to address this on Sunday because this is not a gospel issue. We need to talk about Jesus, and we need to bring people to repentance, and we're not going to talk about these things. We've got our sermon calendar planned for the next year, so we're not going to talk about this. We talked about it. We brought it out, and I actually changed my whole thing to start talking about injustice there. Start talking about, yo, guys, this didn't just happen. Baltimore didn't blow up in 2 weeks here. This was not about Freddie Gray. This has been decades and decades of injustice that's been built up. It's a powder keg. So it wasn't just this tragedy with this young man. This has been building, and you need to understand everything that's been building towards this. And talking about Black Lives Matter, and there's some folks in our church getting salty about that. Why does Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. Police lives matter. We get all that. Everyone's lives matter. But here's why we talk about Black Lives Matter. And for me as an Asian American, just putting out stories like saying, yeah, you know what? I ran 8 miles the other day, which I shouldn't have done, and my body wasn't ready for it. So by the time I got to my house, I couldn't punch in the code for alarm because I was shaking like this. And I did 3 times the wrong code. So the police came to our door. And they came to our door. They saw me there looking like I'm strung out because I'm shaking, sweaty, in bad clothes. And they asked me. They just came up to the door. They said, do you live here? I'm like, yeah. They're like, okay. Well, we just wanted to check. And I wanted our people in the church to know if I was of a color skin that's a little darker, that would not have gone down that way. That would not have gone down that way. But because I'm safe, because I'm Asian, they're like, it's all good. And you need to recognize issues of injustice and inequality and start to talk about these things. And here's the fruit of it. After service, I remember specifically this one young African-American woman. She came up to me, and she's like, you could tell she was pretty emotional, and she just came and said, I just never thought I would hear that from a non-black preacher. So many Christians are just like killing my faith right now. Thank you for just bringing this into conversation. I want to be careful. I'm not saying like one side is right or not. I think there's good room for dialogue. But we've got to be able to have space for everyone to feel like my voice can be heard. How can we have a safe place to talk about these things? And again, the preacher, you get to set the tone. There is power there. So there's positive fruit, but there's a dying to yourself. I keep coming back to that, right? Keep coming back to dying. Sorry. I do that at our church as well because I'm always moving around and throwing things off. One thing about reconciliation is you don't really fit too well into people's boxes. If you're going to pursue reconciliation, you're going to find that you don't fit well into too many people's boxes. So after the riots and, started to get some, just as we're talking about this engaging conversation, I started to get a lot of, I don't want to call it hate mail, but a lot of pushback, a lot of Anglo brothers and sisters. These are Christians, right? Writing me or contacting me saying, why do you hate white people? You're a race baiter. You are divisive. I feel sorry for your church that this is not a church that preaches the Bible, but preaches social justice stuff and evil things like this. And you are the worst kind of shepherd and all this. I'm like, okay. And then I would also get Korean people who would say, yo, why do you like black people more than your own kind? You don't talk nearly enough about store owners who had their whole businesses for decades destroyed. Man, you don't give like 1/10 of the time to talking about injustice to that. What's wrong with you? And I also, going down to north in Pennsylvania in the middle of the riots epicenter, going down there to try to serve and pray and help, got very clear messages from a lot of African Americans there. This is not for you. This is not your thing. This is not you take care of your own stuff. This is for us. So part of dying to yourself is realizing if you're going to preach on reconciliation, you're not going to fit well into people's boxes. You might need to create your own box with some other freaks together. Because preaching reconciliation is not glamorous. It requires death. I know it's all the rage. It's all the books. It's all the conferences right now, multi-ethnicity, diversity. It requires death. I remember in Baltimore, I was meeting with in a group of pastors and one particular chaplain of a school there, a local college. He just came up to me and he said, "You're Korean, right?" I'm like, yeah, I'm Korean. He's like, yo, we got a problem because all of our students are going down to the store in the corner there and they're owned by Koreans and they're just getting eyeballed the whole time. What's going on? I'm like, okay, because I speak for all Korean people, right? I can. and you know, I obviously tried to handle it in a mature way, but I got to be honest, there was a part within me that was kind of starting to rise up and saying, yeah, I know what you're saying. That's messed up that happens. But I also know my friend's mom who got pistol whipped in a robbery. I also know a girl, a college student in our old church, her father got murdered in a gunshot robbery at a store. So you got to understand when people are look like they're being intolerant, it's not just like trying to be mean. There's stuff behind it. I'm not excusing it. There's stories behind all of this. And so the part of me was hurt. There was a small voice within me that wanted to justify and defend and say, well, no, I am Korean. Here's parts of my story. Listen to me. Know how this affects me. But guys, here's what dying to myself looks like. God has shown me that dying to myself means stop looking at things primarily through my lens, but the prism of other people's eyes. Ultimately, what dying to myself means, it's not all about me either. What does it mean for me to step into the shoes and walk with people who are different than me and see life through their eyes? What hurts have others gone through that I might not fully understand? And I remember at a conference a little bit after that, I was actually speaking on similar issues like this, and I just felt led by the Spirit to, about half the group was African American, and I hadn't planned it, it wasn't in my notes, but I just started apologizing. I started saying, I know for some of you in this room, you have been treated as less than human. You've walked into a store, and they have eyed you up and down, watched you, followed you the whole time, made you feel like less than a person, made you feel like a criminal, even though you probably got more education or more wealth than made you feel, clutching purses and all that. And if anyone who's Korean or Asian has done that to you, I just want to sincerely apologize and say, I'm sorry. Even though maybe I didn't do it, I want to say, I'm sorry and ask for your forgiveness. And I felt a little embarrassed for doing that because you put yourself out like that, you feel like a doofus afterwards, right? But after the message, I remember just coming down, and there was just like a line of especially older African-American men and women who were just like waiting in line to talk to me, and tears coming down most of the faces, just coming up. And I remember one lady in particular, she was hugging me and she was saying, in 50 years of a Christian, I've never heard a non-black person say those things before. And it means a lot. It means a lot. And I was reminded that the beautiful thing that happens when we talk about dying to ourselves, when we die to our own rights, we are freed to stand for the rights of others. Because ultimately the gospel is you don't have to fight for your rights anymore because you know Christ has done that for you. He has stood in your place. He's taken upon your guilt and your shame on the cross. It's all paid for. You don't need to fight for those things anymore. It doesn't mean you get trampled on by others, but you don't need to fight for those things. But because you know who you are in Christ and you're secure, now you can be free to fight for the rights of someone else and advocate on their behalf. And here's I want to close with this, guys. During the riots, one of the most unblessing places to be was like on social media, on Twitter or Facebook. Man, it was bad, right? It was really bad. And there were a lot of folks talking about like thuggery and, all this and evil and darkness and the streets of Baltimore. That's where, Satan is moving and rampant. And I wanted to say this, yeah, maybe. But you know where I think Satan is really working right now? It's not on the streets of Baltimore. It's right there on Facebook. It's like churches, and thankfully not our church, but churches like divided along ethnic lines, sniping back and forth at each other, back and forth. And I just had the sense, man, Satan is looking at this and just loving it. That the people who are more than anyone supposed to be united and made one and reconciled because God has reconciled us to him, reconciled to one another, are just divided. And I think what God is calling us, the power of reconciliation at the church and the local church level, this is not a politically correct thing. This is not like a kumbaya, hold hands and, kind of a spur of the moment cultural thing. This is saying, what does it look like to be united when there's absolutely no reason we should be? When the rest of the world is just sniping at each other, what would it look like for folks who have absolutely no reason to be in a room together, to be sitting there, to be worshiping, to pray together because of what God has done? That in our church, we have kind of a way to measure that. Someone should be walking by and look into our church and just like scratch their head saying, what the heck is going on here? Like people who should have absolutely no reason to be with one another, who are sitting there becoming family, and all we can say is, God. God. You want to know why? God. And all to bring it home, preaching matters. Preaching dictates much of that. If you're the preacher in your church, you get to set the tone. As you die to yourself, you get to bring power into your church as God makes himself famous in your context. That's all I got. Thank you, guys.